Donald Trump calls for a takeover and emptying out of the Gaza Strip. We will be talking to a fabled figure in American politics. Former White House Chief of Staff Rahm Emanuel is with us on Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. Any news this week? I mean, is there anything to talk about? Are we just doing a karaoke special this week? I mean, I don't know.
Good, I thought so. I'm ready for that. No, it's the one
I don't think our
commodity.
listeners should be, have that in their face.
We
No,
won't
I don't
inflict.
think so.
We won't inflict that on them. I mean, it's everyone was always saying that the commodity that was going to be in short supply in the Middle East in the future was water. Lots of discussions. No one ever talked about the news supply. There is no shortage of that. And Donald Trump in particular, the gift that keeps on giving. I just worked out the other day because it felt like it's week 17, but it's actually, we're only in the third week of his presidency. The inauguration will be 3 weeks ago on the next Monday. So we're still so early. And yet, who can keep up? It is very clearly deliberate. It's this sort of blizzard of developments which keeps his opponents wrong-footed and unstable, destabilized. But this latest one really takes the biscuit. He was there in the Oval Office and then at a press conference saying what I think almost nobody saw coming, which is, I've got an idea for Gaza, says the president. The Americans will have it. We'll own it, that word own. The people will go elsewhere, they'll be moved elsewhere, and American troops will be on the ground. I mean, just each bit of it is so huge and kind of eye-popping and jaw-dropping that I think people have been unsure how to react, really. Yeah,
I mean, we definitely need to come to terms with the fact that we're now back in Trump land, right? The land of disruption, and not a day, not an hour will go by without a drama of sorts. In a way, I think the world has become a bit addicted to that drama. But before we get into all that, and we have a lot to say, can I just mention something? Just a housekeeping note here, to say that we wanted to remind our listeners that if you'd like to get more of Unholy, more of me or more of Jonathan or more of both, then our Patreon community is where we share bonus episodes, consult with you on how to make the podcast even better, give you early access to events and merch. And let's just say all of this will become very relevant very soon. So I'm using my commercial TV tone and saying, don't miss it. Now we can go back to talking about Trump.
But the thing that's very soon is this the thing where you and I will do a Zoom call with with family members of the Unholy family, live, real time, you and I, fielding questions and in conversation with you, our most devoted listeners. So we're really looking forward to that. And all the information, as you say, is there on but patreon.com/unholypod is where you can find out all of that.
So let's go back to Trump. And on Tuesday, he was talking about the U.S. will take over the Gaza Strip. He wants Palestinians to leave and ideally not to return. All this seemed to be a surprise for his staff as well. You saw the chief of staff, Susie Wiles, and her reaction to that. It was
a great photo, wasn't it?
It was, among others. To my opinion, we should begin to talk about what this really is. And the first thing that your knee-jerk reaction to this is, no, but seriously? But I mean, if the president of the United States is standing in a press conference and before that in the Oval Office talking about this, then you should treat it seriously. Even if your initial thinking is, it's not practical, it's not feasible, but it still has implications in the real world. And we'll go on to talk about this with Rahm Emanuel. But the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, is emboldened by this, right? I mean, a minute ago, and I'm sorry to be self-involved and talk about the Israeli perspective on this, but a minute ago, he was in a precarious political position with the ultra-Orthodox threatening him, with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir leaving his government, Smotrich about threatening to leave the government. Now who's going to leave the government? I mean, Deri, who's saying that Trump is a messenger of God to save the people of Israel. Anyone in the far right who thinks this is their vision coming true of Gaza being cleared of Palestinians, perhaps building Israeli settlements. By the way, Trump didn't say he supported that. But all of this is the main thing. And the other question, of course, and I can get to that later, is that monumental question Israelis are asking themselves: what effect does this have on the second stage of the deal and on Israeli hostages coming back the day after in Gaza? Who's going to put up the money to support this if this is what Trump is declaring? Just a few questions, just throwing out, for the beginning of our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways to react to this. But I think the first one, a basic one, is just to absorb what this is. This is the President of the United States suggesting that 2 million people are emptied out of their homes, forcibly cleared, to make way, as he saw it, for a real estate development. I mean, it is heinous enough when figures of the Israeli far right say, let's clear the Palestinians out of their homes to make way for our homes so that we can have Jewish settlements. That's one thing. I mean, bad enough. But to suggest doing it, robbing people of their homeland so that he can make way for waterfront property, a great, exciting property development for he says, the world's people, meaning rich people to buy houses on the Mediterranean. David Friedman, his former ambassador to Israel, said afterwards, as if it was sort of funny, well, I would be lying if I didn't mention those 25 miles of beachfront property. That's pretty enticing. I think this is sickening to talk like this. This is people's homeland and their homes. So that's as a basic starting point. It is, it's not exaggerated. UN and other people have talked about ethnic cleansing. What does that phrase mean if it doesn't mean clearing people out because you've got you've got your eye on their homes? You're licking your lips at the prospect of their home. So that's just a basic thing. Second thing I just clocked was there's Netanyahu sitting there, the cat that got the cream, smirking. As President Trump is saying, this place is hell. It's a demolition site. Everything in it has been destroyed and flattened. This is the same Netanyahu who had been telling the world, no, this is very selective. It's discriminatory. We're very targeted in our attacks. We're only going after Hamas buildings. There is now Trump, and before them, Steve Witkoff, the envoy, saying, look, Witkoff said, I've been there. It's not going to take 5 years to clean. It's going to take 15 to 20. There is nothing there. There is 30,000 unexploded bombs. I think that is difficult to square with the, Netanyahu talking points up to this point, which is this was a very, focused, limited, targeted attack only on Hamas. It's clear they've destroyed Gaza. So I think be honest about all of that. But yes, I thought too, of the third thing I thought was this is going to ruin the ceasefire talks and hostage release deal, which is delicate and perilous already. But now you've just massively destabilized it. Instead of just letting it play out, the risk is huge, isn't it? That on the Israeli side, far right, people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich are going to say, why on earth would we go along with any deal which gets us to pull out of Gaza when the American president is offering us to keep the whole thing or emptying out the whole thing for us? Why would we accept anything less? But also I've got to say there are two parties to this deal, and Hamas and others will be under pressure from their internal forces to to call a halt to any further hostage releases, because they'll be saying you're playing Trump's game and enabling the emptying out of Gaza. And so I just think on every possible level, there are others, it's just disastrous.
There is a term in psychology, obviously taken from a wonderful film, gaslighting, right, in which you do this manipulation, you sow doubt and confusion in the other person's mind, and that, what you do to them. This is Gaza-lighting. This is sowing confusion and sort of disorienting anyone. When you have Lindsey Graham kind of saying, I'm not really excited about American soldiers going over to Gaza. There's going to be a lot of reaction from obviously the Democrats, but also the Republicans. You see that already. I slightly disagree with your point. I mean, I think it's a really big question. How does this affect the hostage deal, particularly the second stage, which we've talked about the fact that, as you said, it's very, very delicate. I think the Israeli right will actually give Netanyahu the carte blanche. They're going to say, you know what? You can do that because what do we care? At the end of the line, we have an American president saying we're going to clear Gaza of its 2.5 million Palestinians. But I think a main question here is, what is Hamas going to do when they hear this? Why does Hamas still have an incentive to go to the 100%. Second stage of the deal, which is a question in itself? Now, there have been people, by the way, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz saying, this was basically said the reason for this was for Arab nations to propose their own deal. Trump actually doubling down today on Thursday on what he said originally. It's all a confusion. The main question is, does this at the end of the day also lead to a Saudi deal. Is the point here, as if this is a well thought out idea, but is the point here to say, give the Saudis something they can take off the table, like in the Abraham Accords, the annexation was taken off the table, so the Emirates could say, we'll go for this deal. They will take it off the table and then say, look, we succeeded in this, now we can go for a deal, perhaps. I would just make a note, and this is sort of a side note to this, but also important. Israel did not get what it wanted in the Iranian story from the president in this meeting. I think it's important to say. We saw Trump saying on his social media platform Truth, talking about, I want Iran to be great and a successful country, but one that can't have a nuclear weapon. But he would like to see a verified nuclear peace agreement, not necessarily what Israel would have wanted. It would have wanted an American commitment to perhaps attack nuclear sites together with Israel. It didn't get that. So that's another note to be made in this sort of flurry of what was said about Gaza.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And look, I bow to you on your understanding of how the Israeli right will react to this. And I thought your point on that is very interesting. I'm glad that both of us have mentioned how does Hamas react. I think there's been far too little attention on that there are two parties to this ceasefire deal and hostage release deal. And one of them now has a very strong incentive to sabotage the whole thing. And that's why it strikes me as just in the immediate term, unbelievably reckless, even before you get to the kind of long-term meaning. I think your point about Witkoff and Waltz, one being the national security advisor, the other being the special Middle East envoy, coming out afterwards and trying to walk back some of the more egregious aspects. For example, that point about the deployment of U.S. troops, and we get into this in our conversation with Rahm Emanuel later, but that, of course, is a real red flag in American politics. That domestically could alienate Donald Trump's own base, who thought he was going to be the guy to end wars. I think that's the bit that you could lose early on. And in fact, Donald Trump, in his delusional post on Truth Social, said, no, there'll be no US troops. We're essentially going to turn it into some kind of golf course. Everyone's going to be very happy, and don't worry, there won't be a need for troops. But that's what could kill it off stone dead on the American side. Witkoff and Waltz are out there trying to say, no, don't listen to what he said, listen to what we said. I thought that's a fascinating little subplot here. We know that was a part of the drama in the first Trump term, where Rex Tillerson or H.R. McMaster or whatever would come out and try and dilute what the boss had just said. How interesting that even in this new Trump 2.0, where he's got his own people, Witkoff is his best friend, all these loyalists, they're at it again, trying to say, don't take it too literally. I thought I
didn't hear anything after you said I bow to you. So I'm going to agree with everything.
So I'll do that.
I stopped hearing anything. So
I'll do that in body language form later. But the other thing I think is where I agree with you is on this point about as a negotiating tactic. And the thought I had was exactly the one you had, which is the memory of the Abraham Accords, which is how did he get that? He got it by threatening to endorse annexation of the West Bank. And so rather than have that, Bahrain and the others rushed to sign on the dotted line. Is he thinking that this time, rather than have the emptying out of Gaza, whether it's the Palestinian Authority or the Gulf states, they think, okay, we'll agree to some other plan. I'm just not so sure that works, especially because Hamas are not defeated. They're there. And so what other plan is there exactly that is viable, given that nobody, not Netanyahu and not Trump, has offered any kind of day after scenario. This is the only one. I just want to make one last sort of semi-emotional point.
I just want to make a note, not to ruffle your feathers a little bit more, but I'm not sure we've heard the last of that term annexation of the West Bank in general.
Oh, that's on the agenda for next week.
Yeah,
we're told that's imminent. I was going to just come on to that. I mean, he said he's still thinking about that. He said as if that's another threat hanging over the Palestinian side and the Arab side, but also another carrot being dangled in front of those Israeli right-wing ministers. So it goes to your point earlier that maybe they are very tempted by this, the Smotrich and Ben-Gvirs, because it seems as if Trump said things have changed since 4 years ago. A lot of people have been killed. It's very different from 4 years ago. 4 years ago, he was supporting a Palestinian state in 2020. 4 and a bit years ago. Now maybe he's going to just say no. I just want to make one last point, particularly a sort of Jewish reaction. This idea that underpinned what Trump was saying, which was, look, it's horrible, it's a bomb site, move somewhere else. Why not live somewhere else, somewhere where you've got a great development and it's nice and clean? Of all the people who should understand why that is a non-starter for Palestinians, no matter how terrible a state Gaza currently is in, should be Jews and should be Zionists. Because it didn't work when people said to Jews a century ago, what about Uganda? What about Alaska? What about Madagascar? No, the attachment was to this particular land. That was the homeland. Jews of all people should understand where you cannot buy people off by saying you're going to get an apartment and an indoor toilet and you'll be taken care of somewhere else. No, that doesn't fly for either of these two peoples. It doesn't work when people say it to Jews. Why aren't you just happy in New York or in Europe? It doesn't work if you say it to Palestinians. These are two peoples with a claim, with deep roots in this land. And the idea of fobbing them off by saying they're going to be in some new resort somewhere else does not work. It wouldn't work with us, with Jews. It's not going to work with Palestinians.
So as we question what the effect of these Trump statements will have on the continuation of the hostage deal, we should say, and this is a monumental thing for Israelis, right? The fact that 13 Israelis have come back thus far, 5 Thai citizens as well who are working in the kibbutzim. So thus far, 18 people have been released. 3 are scheduled to be released on Saturday if this continues according to plan. On this weekend that has passed, we saw Keith Siegel reunited with his family. By the way, if you didn't catch the conversation with Aviva Siegel, his wife, who was also abducted to Gaza, and we were talking to her just as she was waiting for him. I think that's a very special conversation. Anyone still making any apologies for Hamas should look at the way 65-year-old Keith Siegel returned to his family, frail and fragile. And there was this moment in which Shil Siegel, his daughter, was telling reporters that she read to him the list of the 64 of his friends murdered in Kfar Aza on October 7th, a reminder of what these people not only went through, tormented by Hamas, but what they're returning to. What they're returning to is a shattered reality that they have to start picking up the pieces. Ofer Calderon also returned to his family, and of course, Yarden Bibas. Every release is a happy one. This release has, besides that, or apart from that, a very deep, dark cloud of uncertainty. We should say that his wife, Shiri, and his sons, Ariel and Kfir, there is grave concern about their fate. Hamas had said at the beginning of the war that they were killed by Israeli airstrikes, and Israel has said already officially that it has grave concerns. And think of this man coming back and coming home alone. He has his mother and his father and his sister and the rest of the family, but he doesn't know. And in a sense, he is released from the hell of Hamas's hands, but walking into a hell of uncertainty. This story of a modern day Job, essentially, is obviously a story that has caught headlines not only in Israel, but obviously outside Israel as well.
Yeah, I mean, but I don't think enough attention actually on that, on his case, the idea of, yes, freedom, but coming back to, what is feared to be a catastrophic bereavement. I mean, his whole family. And yes, I think where there was attention around the world, of course, is they became sort of totemic, the images of the children, the red-headed baby, those photographs. You would see them on placards at demonstrations for the hostages, and the notion that those children and their mother may not be alive is just a heartbreaking one. This has been, every one of those people released, every family. It's a whole universe. It's a whole world of pain and grieving that will go on for decades. Actually, I mean, it's a really huge story there, and I understand how you said that Israelis are obviously very focused on that. I understand that. My thoughts at the moment are very much relating to our earlier conversation with those people who have been waiting, as it were, on the edge of their seat for the next stage, how they must be just wishing this could just be completed before anyone starts coming up with big schemes that destabilize everything, because the risk could be felt by them personally in the sense of reunions that were about to happen that may now not happen. That's the fear I would certainly be having.
There are still 79 hostages held by Hamas a year and 4 months after. We are beginning to hear the stories of those coming back. For example, Yarden Gonen, who's Romi's sister, saying she's beginning to tell us the stories, and 99.9% of the stories are horrendous, she said. You're hearing not only of starvation and of torment and of torture, but also of the fact that they heard about their families and the protests in Israel to have them released, and it gave them strength and power and hope. And you hear about the differences, by the way, between the people being held. They moved around a lot. Some of them were held underground and above ground. But the differences, the main differences between the people who were held together and had someone to go through this with and the people who weren't. I think that's also a sort of a dramatic shift. So this is, we hope, continuing on Saturday.
Yeah, and a reminder to listen to Yonit's conversation with Aviva Seagull, that point about the holding hands and that togetherness she did have with Keith, and then her heartbreaker having to leave him on his own, and just the, those moments when their captors would not allow people, the consolation of touch. It's really a very powerful conversation that you had with her, and people should go back to hear that.
One more thing making news here in Israel before we go to our special guest, Ambassador Emanuel, this week. I think it's a saying attributed to Philip Graham of the Washington Post that journalism is the first draft of history. And in this case, I think it's true. An interview that ex-defense minister Yoav Gallant, defense minister up until the beginning of November 2024, gave my colleague Amit Segal and me this week on Channel 12. It really is look, there are three people in this country who could chronicle exactly what happened, the decision-making, what decisions were made, what weren't, the politics, all of it, what was going on in the rooms that the decisions were made in. There are three people who can tell that story, right? One is Netanyahu, one is Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi, and one is Yoav Gallant. And he goes through everything that happened from October 7th, the shock of that morning. By the way, the person who calls him up at 6:29 is his daughter, telling him there are rockets falling on Tel Aviv. This is the defense minister of the state of Israel on the biggest terrible calamity and surprise Israel ever faced. So he goes through that day and what those emotions were. And throughout the war, I found a few things interesting in that interview that he gave us. One is the hostage deal, and the ex-minister and the most important person in the government after the prime minister saying the Israeli government did not do enough to bring back the hostages, talking about how this deal was sabotaged inside the Israeli government, the politics of it. When we ask him about the Biden administration always putting the blame on Hamas, he says essentially they have their considerations too, insinuating that there was politics there as well. But him saying this is not, we did not do enough to bring back the hostages. I found that very important. In Yoav Gallant's view, what happened 4 days after October 7th, meaning his plan to attack Hezbollah at the time, we saw that play out almost a year after. He wanted to do it 4 days after October 7th, and Netanyahu was hesitant. He thinks it's the biggest mistake Israel made, strategic mistake in its history, and that should have been done at that point. Just generally, the way he describes Netanyahu in those first weeks of the war, he calls him pessimistic, I would add hesitant and frightened to do, this is my words, but I'm interpreting what he said, not only against this operation against Hezbollah 4 days after October 7th, but also very hesitant and reluctant when it comes to the ground incursion in Gaza.
Just two things there. When you said that he said that there was foot dragging, or much worse, even sabotage of the hostage release deal from within the Israeli government, was explicit pointing the finger that it was Netanyahu who prevented a deal being done when it could have been done much earlier?
Yeah, well, first of all, we should remember where Yoav Gallant is. He left the Knesset, but he wants to return to the Likud. So he does criticize Netanyahu, but he's careful in the way that he does it. He tells a story of how Bezalel Smotrich got a leak from the cabinet about the hostage deal and its terms, particularly 18 hostages being released. And then he leaked it to the media and said, I'm not going to agree to this deal. So it's insinuated that the person who gave him that leak to Smotrich is Netanyahu. He doesn't say it officially, but he does say that this deal, a better deal, could have been reached and could have been reached sooner. When he says the government didn't do enough to release the hostages, it's clear who he means.
And when we say sooner, we should say, therefore, that means actual lives. People, we mentioned the group who were killed in August. Those lives, these hostages could be alive now. That's why it isn't just politics. This is real. The other thing left out just there was in your account was the notion that he regards it as a huge mistake not to have hit Hezbollah a year earlier. Mm-hmm. A lot of people would have thought, well, what difference? In the end, Israel did hit them and hit them extremely hard in a kind of regionally tectonic plate shifting way, beginning with the pager attack and then taking out of Nasrallah and other senior command figures. There are diminished force. What did Gallant say would have been gained by doing all of that, but a year earlier?
So first of all, he thinks that if the plan had been executed earlier, he thinks many more Hezbollah operatives would have been dead. He was talking about the number 15,000, which of course does not cripple an organization. It destroys it completely. He also thinks that then the Israelis that have been evacuated from the north for over a year could have returned to their homes, and it would have signaled to the whole region not to mess with us. He was talking about the art of war. Remember, this is a general originally, not a politician, and saying your biggest enemy was Hezbollah, not Hamas. You should have shocked them and surprised them in a tactical way. Again, history kind of played out that way. About a year later, he thinks it still would have been a better move to do. At the beginning, I'm sure you're wondering about the way the war was conducted in Gaza. He does relate to that and say, again, this is an Israeli politician from the Israeli right. He does say mistakes were made, but that he is proud of the soldiers and the way that they conducted the war. This is a man who obviously has an arrest warrant issued from the ICC in The Hague. So that was his reaction to that. He didn't seem too fluttered about that. Again, it's an account of a man who went through, no one had this tumultuous tenure as a defense minister in the history of this country. I think it's just interesting, incredibly interesting, actually, to listen to what his version of the events were.
Yeah, it's a pity, really, that he is so, I think, deluded, but determined to have a career back in the Likud and still trying to keep options open and preserve his standing with that party, because I think he would speak even more candidly about who is to blame. But instead, he's obviously preserving his political viability. I think where he's erring is he does have that arrest warrant out there for him. Even at the different court, the International Court of Justice, in that genocide case brought by South Africa, it's his words that are central to that case. And I think he could have used this chance to actually clarify a lot of what he said. I think there's some misunderstandings. People think he was talking about Palestinian population of Gaza. He was actually, I think, talking about Hamas, but he could have really used this interview to be explicit, crystal clear. It might have helped him with his own legal case. I think because he's still got one eye looking over his right shoulder and concerned to stay credible with the right, he didn't perhaps go as far as he might have done, and that might be a mistake that he comes to regret.
But I think it's also interesting to talk about responsibility and how he's, in a sense, shirking the responsibility of everything that has to do with October 7th and explaining why it wasn't his fault. This is not only a man who thinks he can return to the Likud, it's a man who thinks he can return to public life with this stain of October 7th on him as well. He thinks, of course, that there should be a commission of inquiry and that commission will decide who is to blame. But, this is a question. How much, if we're sitting here thinking that Netanyahu is responsible, then how can the defense minister at the time not be responsible?
So we began this episode talking about Donald Trump, this bombshell proposal of his for the emptying out of Gaza and for U.S. ownership. It seems absolutely like the right week to talk to somebody steeped in American politics, given American politics, and particularly the Democratic Party, are at a loss to how to handle this phenomenon where this new president says something huge and paradigm shifting every 20 minutes. I mean, a whole lot of stuff domestically that obviously here we're not going to get into, but how they're coping with that. A lot of people have said that they need a big strategic political brain at the helm, and the name a lot of people mention, saying this is the person who should be in charge of democratic strategy, in charge of opposing Donald Trump, is our guest this week.
Rahm Emanuel is a legend of American politics, a former aide to Bill Clinton, White House chief of staff for Barack Obama, twice elected as mayor of Chicago, elected 3 times as a member of Congress, and just returned from Tokyo, where he served as U.S. ambassador to Japan under President Joe Biden. It's quite a career, Ambassador Emanuel. Thank you very much for talking to us today on Unholy.
Thank you.
We have so much to talk about. I think we should probably start with
that is the understatement of the day. Okay, yeah, we have a lot to talk about. Yeah. Anything happening in the news that we should cover?
Just a little Trump plan about Gaza that perhaps we could open up with and ask you, just to start off, what do you think about that, of the president's proposal that Gaza's people be relocated and the United States takes ownership of the Gaza Strip?
Well, I have like close to 20 thoughts, so let me try to get through the first 4 without. One is, if you were thinking as a real estate, great, but this is a national security issue, and on that, he gets an F. There's anybody that knows any knowledge of the history of the region, or particularly Arab-Israeli conflict in the history, this is not only not a non-starter, and it's worse than that. One, from an American perspective, obviously you have an Israeli audience, etc. But from an American perspective, our 2 experiences with both our recent Iraq, which is over $1 trillion, thousands of kids lost their lives, and thousands were maimed in the process, and physically and mentally and emotionally destroyed. And that is a horrible experience. And Paul Bremer is not, in my view, one that's looking for work. But if Iraq was a disaster, this would be that in magnitude, not just because geography, while it's smaller, the responsibilities and the consequences are much bigger. Second, the last time the United States, or in addition to Iraq, put troops anywhere within on the ground was Lebanon, 1983. And 200 plus Marines lost their lives. America cut and run in that situation and set off a generation of terrorism because they knew there was a price America would never pay. So just from our perspective, let alone that the president said he wouldn't do things like this in a different form, this is like Iraq and Lebanon on steroids. From a regional standpoint, I think it's also a disaster. I think President Trump inherited a better situation in the greater Middle East from his predecessor than any president in recent times, having served both President Obama and President Clinton, one as chief of staff, one as senior advisor. No president like Joe Biden's handed off a better structured situation, both on the Iranian front and on the Israel Gulf front, i.e. Saudi, than President Trump. In one fell swoop of a press conference, he irritated Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and all the Sunni Arab Gulf and immediate Arab countries in the area that are our allies, that are pillars of our foreign policy and our position. And the only country smiling or leader smiling is Iran. So you've put the Saudi, just by one way to illustrate this point, you put the Saudi prince in an untenable situation between not only public opinion, but his base of political support is among young Saudis. This will be seen, nobody will want to be seen, specifically MBS, as an agent of America's rewriting of the geography of the region. And you've put him in an untenable position between his position on Iran, his position in the area, his position with the United States, and his position with his public. And no politician will break faith with their public, whether you're Democratic or not. Public opinion carries weights in autocracies, kingdoms, and democracies. And you're putting him in an untenable position. You're putting the king of Jordan, the president of Egypt, the royal families in both Oman, UAE, Bahrain, all in a horrible position. And the Iranians, who thought they were the iced out party, are smiling like I've never seen. So I think from that position, it's a mess. Now, I'm only on point 3, so I got like 17 more to go. But just in case you want to get to question number 2, this is now, and I, while the Prime Minister of Israel may be smiling, he's going to realize that it may have felt good for, it's like, certain meals. It may feel good for like the first 10 seconds, and then you're hungry again. This is going to be a problem for Israel because one is it's going nowhere. Two, it is a problem if you're trying to achieve and make the most of the sacrifices of the IDF in the region. And those to make the most, you have Iran on its heels, strategically, politically, diplomatically in the region, and its back foot on its back heels. It's never been like that in recent months. You have a closer deal that could have been. You now have the people you're trying to work with in the Sunni world feeling iced out, and you have the one country you actually had cornered feeling like they have a breakout moment. So while the Prime Minister may be smiling and think it's great, I actually think you're going to look like you're the dog that, as we would say in America, the dog that caught the car. This is not going to be good.
So I noticed there that the arguments you made focused on American self-interest, that this is not in America's self-interest, and also on the dumb geopolitics of it, that regionally it doesn't work. In Europe, I've noticed that the counter-arguments that are being made are legal, that it's against international law to do this to people, and they're moral. And they're moral, which is it's wrong to forcibly transfer people from their homes. Do I take from your answer that it goes nowhere to oppose this on those grounds, and instead the way to argue it is Americans will be put in harm's way and they'll die, it makes no sense regionally?
If I was sitting in Congress, the argument I would make, wait a second, we're going to spend all that money in the Gaza Strip. What about the schools in our neighborhood? What about the healthcare hospitals in our neighborhood? When I was a member of Congress, and George Bush was introducing, always annually would increase funding for Iraq. I had a bill called the American Parity Act. For every school you build in Iraq, you got to build one in the United States. For every hospital you got to build there, you're going to build one here. I think on a political domain, and I'm sorry, I am speaking to the American public, because I do believe on national security grounds, it's in America's interest to understand the consequences of 238 dead Marines in Lebanon that ushered in a generation of terrorism because it legitimized that there was a price America would pay and we would leave. But also when you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, the other end of the goalpost, which is in Iraq, we spent way over $1 trillion, built on a lie and deception, and thousands of young men and women, the promise of America, lost their lives, and thousands of men and women are maimed physically and emotionally. And it was the ultimate example of hubris. I think Iraq was the single worst on-goal foreign policy mistake ever in the United States history, and we have a lot of competition for that title. And I think this would be Iraq and Lebanon all wrapped up into one. And I also believe, in the end of the day, it's not going anywhere. But in the short term, with public opinion and the one thing I do know from both being a chief of staff, a congressman, a mayor, but also an ambassador representing the United States, we all operate under one piece of currency in foreign policy. It's called trust. Mm-hmm. That trades. And if people don't have trust in you, your trading and your capacity and your stock, I'm trying to think of language that President Trump would understand, goes down. And we just have a massive hit on our trust number because nobody is going to go stand alongside. And I think he had a potential on both Iran and Israel, Saudi Arabia to get I wrote about this in the Washington Post, a major breakthrough. I would nominate him for the Nobel Peace Prize if he got it. And I think he just hurt America in a dramatic way. If Europe wants to argue moral and legal, that's not a wrong argument. It may be more salient with the European audience. But my experience, I'm not worried about, not that I'm not worried about European, but that's not where I'm thinking about. Yeah. I think here at home, the idea you're going to build anything in Gaza while there's building needed here at home is where I would go at this, because I think it's A, true, and B, it's politically salient, or as President Clinton used to say, that will cut like a hot knife through butter. Yeah. Just will.
But what if all this is just a negotiation tactic? He wasn't serious about it. He was putting an outrageous idea out there. By the way, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz already said that his plan is intended to pressure neighboring Arab nations to propose their own solution. So a little bit like the Abraham Accords were like, let's put the annexation, we'll throw that away just to get this deal. We'll throw this idea away just to get a Saudi deal. I mean, isn't that an option here?
Could be. Could be. But there's a history of comments in and around this idea that go back even longer than recent tactical moves. And the one thing I know about politics, nothing ends. Everything is a cause and effect to something else. Now, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you don't need trust to operate in international affairs, or you don't need trust. The one thing I will give you an anecdote and experience. Early on in President Clinton's tenure, Richard Nixon came in. And he said, one of the things you got to know about, don't forget this. I can't imitate Nixon the way I can imitate Bill Clinton, but his basic point was, in that very dark kind of look of his, forget the State Department. Only you can pick up the phone and call a head of state in another country and say, this is the President of the United States, this is what I need. Well, if you screwed them once, and you want to pick up the phone for something else, if you think the world ends after that deal, of the negotiation, it ends, great. But guess what? The world continues. And if your trust bank account goes down to zero, could be a negotiating tactic, but the collateral damage on trust for the second act, for the third act, we don't know what, I don't think Hamas or Hezbollah are going to do anything today. We don't know what Iran's going to do. I mean, you're assuming the world stays stagnant for X period of time. It doesn't. I don't have to tell you this. You live in a very dynamic region.
Dynamic is an understatement.
Nice way of putting it.
Talk about.
Nothing stands still for 24 hours. So the idea that, it's a negotiating, but look, things change. He's a good friend of mine. Other people in the Biden administration wrote, the Middle East has never been more stable. That was October 6th. Yeah. October 7th didn't look like that. That didn't look like a very good prediction. So it's a negotiating tactic. Well, okay, but it still has consequences on your trust factor. And I will just tell you, the United States is a trusted security. One of the reasons Iran is backed up is they saw when the United States and Israel back a deal with each other from a security standpoint. Guess what? Your missiles don't work. They just don't. Okay, that has a after effect. Not just knocking the missiles down, it makes Iran much more susceptible to working a peace deal. You want to decide, you want to destroy America's credibility, America's trust factor in the process of a negotiating tactic? Well, if you had actually discussion in the Situation Room, I'm not sure that's the price worth paying.
Okay, so that's the long-range danger of this, but let's just narrow in on it for the immediate...
I think I don't agree with you. I think it's an immediate consequence. I don't agree with... If you think it only holds to that region, if you're in the Indo-Pacific where I left...
Yeah.
That nothing stays within the cone of the body of water you're talking about. Right. I don't agree with that.
But no, what I was going to say is, just even in its own terms, as an immediate tactic, does it even work there? In other words, if you're Saudi Arabia and you're under pressure to do a normalization deal with Israel, do you think, okay, we're not going to hold out now for the Palestinian state as before, we're just going to say yes to this to avert the emptying out of Gaza? If you're Hamas, do you think, we'll go through the 3 stages of the ceasefire because this is on the alternative? In other words, just as an in-the-moment tactic, does it even work in those terms besides the other dangers you're rightly pointing out?
A lot of people think foreign policy is, I used to say this when I was ambassador, because when you look at Rahm Emanuel, diplomat does not come running up into the...
we have a question about that further in the...
into the marquee with bright lights, okay? But a lot of people, Rahm Emanuel in Japan, guess what? You're not a double-breasted gray flannel suit smoking a pipe with air filled. No, and as I said in a piece in the Post, it's politics just on another chessboard. That's all it is. And I think my view is, when I look at a political situation, I go, okay, what is his or her politics? What is the goalpost you want him to, and what is the goalpost holding him back? And how do you navigate that so you can move that goalpost that they're looking over their shoulder at closer? look, I'm not in the business of giving MBS political advice. I think he knows Saudi Arabia much better than I do, but I think I have some familiarity. His popular support inside Saudi Arabia is generational. It's his generation. They were tired of seeing the world around them in UAE, in the rest of the Gulf, pass them by. And he has done things, if you look, there's a consistency that is investing in a future and doing things in a future. Now, he keeps his right flank covered, but his political base, I'm being generic here, is 40 and younger Saudi Arabia, 40 years and younger. You who have an affinity post the Gaza war to the Palestinian cause that they had before, but it was not emotional. Now it's emotional. You're putting him in between his political base and his national security aspirations, and you've made it harder, not easier. The goal of a negotiations is how to make it easier. When you do a deal, you got to understand the other guys or the other gals' politics. And I think this is a mess. And again, I don't do Saudi politics, but I look at the Saudi Arabian MBS and I look at what he's doing, and you're putting him between his political support and his rock bid 40 and younger Saudis and his national security interests, and you made it harder. It was hard before. You made it exponentially harder for him to get to a yes. That is nuts. Over the Gaza Strip, which you could have gotten without any of that collateral damage.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, what a lot of Israelis were listening for in that press conference was Trump's, commitment to the deal to the end of it, meaning bringing back all of the hostages. There is some suspicion among groups in Israel whether the prime minister would want that or not, because that entails the end of the war. And I'm curious about one thing. I interviewed Yoav Gallant, former defense minister, this week, and he said, listen, the deal, and we should say, by the way, you have been in contact with hostage families. You were talking about the hostage plight for a very long time as your ambassador in Japan since October 7th. And Gallant is saying this. He says, we have the same deal on the table that we had in July. What has changed? Yes. Netanyahu values Trump more than Ben-Gvir, and that wasn't true for Biden. And I wonder if you agree with that. And then do we have to live in a world in which we give credit to you give credit to the Trump administration for getting this deal done?
Look, I mean, the deal was there. From what I understand, both in the public domain and in private, different parties at different moments switched the goalposts. That's not such a shock ever happening in any negotiation, but that happened. I'm not going to, I think it's pretty clear that I have let me say it this way. I don't have diplomatic immunity anymore to have my comments about the prime minister, but it's our relationship is been well written about.
It was a dynamic relationship. Let's put in the understatement of the.
Who knew you were a diplomat? That's a nice term, and I'm not sure diplomatic immunity covers what I'd like to say.
Go ahead.
But go and say it. Go ahead and say it. You're in the right place.
Yeah, exactly. I really appreciate you guys both on the legal and political advice. I'll hire you at another day. So look, here, in the end of the day, the way I describe it is that the administration was moving forward inches by inches and inches. The deal was set. And the prime minister and the masquerading Hamas leadership, both in the Strip and outside the Strip, they changed it all the time. As I used to say, without saying who I said it to in the White House and the administration, I said, look, everybody's in the shock trying to figure out if they can get the last camel, the last goat, and the last chicken. It's just, I remember from my time at the Oslo Accords, we were about to walk out. There's 30, 40 minutes. You know why there's 30, 40 minutes late before they come out of the White House? Because Arafat wanted not Palestinian, he wanted PLA. So we had to go through every document. It's all written in pencil because he had to get the last goat. That's what happened. Okay, he wanted the last goat, and that okay. So I'm sure that changes. The administration was moving forward inches by inches. Did it move forward when, and in a rare moment, I thought it was actually America stood tall when it showed that a Democratic president, a Republican president, in a current administration, outgoing administration, would work hand in glove in doing it. Now, I actually think, all you guys say, does Trump deserve credit? Does Biden deserve credit? I actually think that's all wrong. I think that's absolutely 100% wrong. You know who deserves credit? The people of Israel and the people of Gaza Strip, because the Hamas leadership was cornered because the people had suffered a price that they did not realize they were going to pay on October 7th at 6 a.m. Mm-hmm. They pressured them. You had the head of religious leader in Gaza tell Hamas that they were absolutely worse for making this decision and bringing this war to the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza were openly for the first time in 20 years on social media saying the Hamas leadership were dirtbags for what they did. And the people that went to Dizengoff Square, went to the Peace Square, that went in and out of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Haifa, protesting, asking for these young men and women to come home and be home with their families. They are the winners in this process because they forced political leaders to do something they did not want to do. Now, do I think President Biden and Donald Trump can walk around trying to figure out in the United States who gets credit? Sure. That's not beyond any American politician to do that. But the real credit, in my view, to move this thing forward, that forced this, were the people of the Gaza Strip that were paying a horrendous price for a disastrous leadership and a disastrous decision by the Hamas leadership. You're not going to kill 1,200 people, rape women, cut uteruses of women, and think you're not going to bring unending violence and pain to your own people. If you did, as I often say, look, I'm for a ceasefire. I was for the one on October 6th when you had 20,000 Palestinians working in Israel. You're the one that ended that. You're the one that has ended every one of the last 5. Now, that said, I think the other credit goes to the Israeli people who never lost faith with their fellow citizens in the tunnels of Gaza Strip. And Bibi Netanyahu, I shouldn't have said it, would the prime minister have liked to not have that protest? Would not have it change public opinion? Sure he would. But the credit goes to the two publics, not to anybody else. Because they created and forced a situation that everybody else wanted to make a different price for, or pay a different price.
I do want to take you into, if I may, into U.S. politics. And
what is that picture behind you, Yonit?
Oh, it's the sort of, imagining the beach. I'm a Jerusalemite originally, and so Tel Aviv is still a suspicion to me. So this is the closest I'm getting to the beach.
Yeah, I like the version. Jonathan and I have to show, because we're insecure, books behind us because we're so intellectually insecure.
I'm good. I'm good.
You're good with just a beach image.
With Jonathan, I mean, half the books are his. He wrote them. So if you're talking about showing off intellectual superiority.
No, he's talking about intellectual inferiority complex.
Yeah, no, I wasn't. I was talking about intellectual insecurity.
Insecurity.
A lot different than inferiority.
True. Point taken. It's the smallest room in the house I was exiled to. I was going to ask about, obviously the fallout of this election for Democrats, because this is different from the 2016 election. It's not the 80,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin.
I was really enjoying the Middle East. Do we have to talk about the Midwest?
Very short on American politics, and we can talk about Jewish stuff.
I prefer the Mideast versus the Midwest today. Go ahead.
A little less. You can a little less complicated. I'm not going to ask you what happened to Democrats in this election because it could take, all of your time. But I wonder if you feel like the lessons were learned. If there is a, cheshbon nefesh, as they're going through thinking about what to do next. Yeah. Do you feel that?
We're on day 2 of sitting Shiva for a week. My view is there's 3 elements to analyzing 2024. One is 70% of the country thought the country was headed in the wrong direction. So that's a de facto anti-incumbent mood. So that's not whether it was going to be Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. That was 70%. If you owned any part of that 70%, you were a dead armadillo in the middle of the road. Then there's a second layer, which is below that, where Kamala Harris runs below the ticket, meaning below a senator, below a congressman, below a governor in their state. That's unusual. That's on her and on the campaign. It didn't have to happen that way. That I attribute that piece in big part. They decided to run against Kamala Harris of presidential Democratic primary of 2020, not the Kamala Harris of 2024. And the campaign was not adept at dealing with that. And more ads and more pieces were spent on the cultural pronouns, etc., than on other pieces in the advertising. Then the third layer, which is much deeper and not just about 2024, but really about this period of time, is, in my view, is about the absolute disaster of both the Iraq war, a war built on lies, deception, cost trillions of dollars and thousands of lives, and not one person responsible was ever held accountable. 6 years later, you had a massive financial meltdown. And again, I mean, I was in the Obama White House, I was advocating for what was then called, I dubbed Old Testament justice, take a banker in the middle of the public square and beat the living crap out of them. Because there had to be a catharsis, let alone they were responsible for some of the worst financial mismanagement of the country. And they were arguing for their bonuses. And again, no banker was held accountable. Nobody. So the country walked away hating the establishment, creating both loss of lives and loss of livelihood. Nobody in responsible position was held accountable, legally, politically, or anywise, or financially. And then you fast forward during COVID, Democrats prior to that have been the party of anti-establishment, shaking things up. And we don the jacket of the establishment. You have to close schools. You have to close the places of worship and eat your peas and shut. And they, in a period of time, the Republicans became the anti-establishment. And there's a larger, when you look at Europe, you look at your elections in Israel, you look at UK elections, you look at anywhere in the world, it's not just an anti-incumbent. The establishment, and I take this, a lot of people looked in our politics, they look at divisions based on college degrees versus no, male versus female, white versus other race and ethnicities, urban versus rural. To me, the real divide is establishment versus everybody else. And when you look at the killing of the United Health CEO and the cheering online and social media, this was not because he got a tax cut or anything. It was the establishment versus everybody else. And if you look at the currents in the developed world, at least, and somewhat the undeveloped world, or developing world rather, there is a resentment, properly earned, of the establishment. Because the establishment in the last 20 years has failed the public miserably. Horrible. And with never, ever paying a single financial, political, or legal consequences or reputational. And people are walking around with homes undervalued, kids not being able to go to college, kids affected by eras of depression and loss of a future. And, I don't know your family, Jonathan. My kids are going to be fine. Grew up in a loving home, got a good education. They're going to be fine. They'll figure their way around, etc. But that's not true for everybody. At least I'm going to speak about it as an American. The American dream is more costly, more unaffordable, more inaccessible than ever before. So therefore, it's not the American dream. And people have a right to be pissed off. They have a right to be angry. The problem we face is when we have faced these challenges before as a country, we were gifted with leaders like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, gifted with leaders like Abraham Lincoln, gifted with leaders like, I would say Truman, you can say John Kennedy, that have found a way to navigate America's troubled waters to a better place. Mm-hmm. That's not true at this moment. And so I look at each of the layers and I do analyze both the immediate and then a deeper current underneath our politics. And as a progressive, you cannot have progressive government if the public doesn't think government is an affirmative force. The basic understanding of a progressive view of government, or progressive politics, I should say, is the public has to start out with an affirmative view of government. And right now, they don't think we can run a one-car parade. Okay, and that's pretty, parades usually are supposed to be 20 cars. They don't think we can do a one-car parade. Then if they don't think that, and they're very cynical about the government's capacity, it is very hard to have a progressive set of politics. And I think, the Democratic Party should not, there's a series of things, like I'll give you the way I would illustrate this point to make a finer point on it. We're arguing about the name of a school and what bathroom a child can use. We just had a report that the worst reading scores for 8th graders in 30 years. Now, to me, schools are about whether kids can do reading, writing, and math, not what bathroom they're allowed access to and what the name of the school is on the front. And I'm not saying those aren't important, but they're not core to the mission of a school. The core purpose of a school is that 8th graders graduate not only knowing how to read, because it's going to make their high school years easier. Their high school years are foundational to their further education. And we're not talking about the fact that in the last 30 years, the single worst reading scores in the history of the United States are now. And we're still arguing about what sports you can participate, what gender categories you can have, which bathrooms you can use, and whether the person on the name on the school was a founding father that we think was wrong. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be tolerant to those issues. They're important. But they don't overwhelm and trump the core purpose, which is our kids can't read. And I kind of jokingly, so I want to say this jokingly because my kids yell at me. I'm okay whatever pronoun you want to use. First test, tell me what a pronoun is. Okay, when you tell me what a pronoun is, you use whatever pronoun you want. Now, I say that as a joke because my kids are going to be haunted that I made that, okay? And I don't have to worry about the Federal Communication Commission. I have to worry about being yelled at by my children, okay? So, but my point is, we're arguing about what's my pronoun, not illegitimate to the people that are going through issues. I'm tolerant. I'm just not going to be an advocate. Big difference. I'm tolerant. We're a party of tolerance. But we have turned into a party of advocacy. I am for reading. I used to joke when I became mayor, I was 6 feet 2 inches. After dealing with these education, I'm now 5 feet 8 inches. I lost 6 inches, okay? We have to, that's, the school is about reading. And also teaching tolerance, not advocacy. Big difference.
So
that's a long, and you're going to probably edit it all out. But
no, we won't at all. Just people listening to you will.
Jonathan,
we're just leaving in the intellectually insecure stuff, and the rest we're cutting.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Just as long as you make sure that Jonathan's part of the intellectually insecure caucus of this three-way. Okay.
I'm a charter member. So
I'm a middle child. I'm a founding member.
So we have to ask you this because of the kind of podcast we do here, which is about you as a politician and a political figure who is Jewish, whether or not that, you think of yourself as a Jewish politician, you're a politician who's Jewish. One thing we've asked a lot of guests who've come on the podcast over the last 14, 15 months is about their sense of themselves after October the 7th and what impact that had on their Jewishness. You encounter people all the time in the United States, in Britain, in diaspora, who say it did something for their Jewish identity. People who weren't that strongly Jewish identified before felt it more afterwards. You made a lot of being Jewish as ambassador to Tokyo. We could talk about some of that. But just tell us what you have sensed in this last year, particularly when, even from a distance, observing the United States, there has been a rise of anti-Semitism. Just tell us how it's affected you personally, as well as a political figure.
So, well, first of all, I grew up in American politics where my first name is Rahm. I think the only other person I knew was the doctor that saved my life, Rahm Emanuel. So it's not like, and as my full name is Rahm Israel Emanuel. Not even if you wanted to hide. Not really easy, okay?
Yeah.
But I've made my way through American politics. Look, I take the opposite view. Not opposite. So when I ran for Congress, the congressional seat I held was held by Dan Rostenkowski, Frank Annunzio, Roman Puczynski, Mike Flanagan, Rod Blagojevich, all European Catholic, Eastern European Catholic, except for Annunzio and Flanagan, but basically Catholic. It's a Catholic district.
Yeah.
Rahm Israel Emanuel does not fit in that lineage. The population of the congressional district that I represented was maybe 3% Jewish. So I think the American people, if you meet them on their front stoop, you meet them in their schools, you meet them at their places of worship, very accepting. And when I ran for Congress, I ran against a woman of Polish descent, and there was an ugly comment said by a supporter of hers, not her, but said by a supporter. And I was asked then, a very ugly comment about my loyalty to the United States.
Can you tell us what it was for people who don't know?
No, it was a bit attack on dual loyalty and kind of comment. And I said, look, I've met the people of this district on their front stoops. They're people of good values and good judgment, and I have confidence in them. And they're raising their kids to know right from wrong, and they'll see wrong for what it is. And I ended up not only winning, but I ended up winning comfortably, and I ended up winning my re-elections by ever bigger amounts. Each election, I went higher and higher. When I ran for mayor, Chicago's not a Jewish city by any stretch of the imagination.
You were the first and to this point last Jewish mayor of Chicago.
And so again, and then he became a friend. That one of the person's union leaders said something that was pretty ugly in the first election. And when I ran for Congress, I was the only candidate that was required to show his birth certificate.
Wow.
And I had
Who required you to do that?
There was the Tribune, Chicago Tribune, demanding that I had to prove that I was both born in the country, born in the city, that I had U.S. citizenship, that I wasn't a dual citizen or dual loyalty, et cetera, blah, 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 blah. There was other comments also said later on from mayor. And again, Chicago, maybe 3-4% Jewish on election day. So I was elected mayor and reelected mayor in a non-majority, not even close. It never even got to double digits Jewish. Now, I'm ambassador during the height of somebody at our cottage in Michigan near the beach, spray painted Nazi symbols. And I don't know who, a neighbor somewhere, painted it over immediately. I don't know who it is. Never has called me, never notified me. So can I focus on the Nazism? Yeah. Can I focus on the fact that a neighbor, unbeknownst to me and still to this day, out of their own self-interest, decided that wasn't going to be how the neighborhood was known and painted it over and spray painted it, blasted it away? You say a rise in anti-Semitism. I'm not so sure. Anti-Semitism has always been high. It's the difference in my view is there's a permission slip today that did not exist 10 years ago. It has always been high. Anti-Semitism always has existed and is always high. The difference today versus 10 years ago, or at least when I first ran in 2002, so 2 decades ago, is the permission slip. So now it's more public, and if you want it to be, I don't mean but I'm glad it's out. Let's deal with it. Let's rock and roll. Okay, I'm in. Okay, rather than some explicit or rather implicit snide remarks or little comments off to the side, I do want to say the only person that I know explicitly in my 10-year public life that ever said anything about my Judaism was the Prime Minister of Israel. I've never had anybody else
who was the same man then and now, we should say.
All I'm saying is that in my public life, the only person who's actually publicly questioned my commitment to my faith is the Israeli Prime Minister. Nobody else. And never brought up my faith. They may have said certain things under their breath, but they never said it publicly.
Jonathan, let me just put the pieces together of the puzzle, because we should also add to your Jewish identity the fact that you went to Anshe Emet Jewish Day School in Chicago, and so did I. We know it's a good school just by that fact.
Well, I don't know. Neither one of us have our photo on the wall. Okay, that's all I'll say.
I had bangs. It was very embarrassing. But the point of this is, by the way, you mentioned your middle name being Israel. Let's talk a little bit, if I can, about the Israeli connection. I'm not wrong to say that your father was Israeli, fought for the Irgun, which is quite amazing, if I'm not mistaken.
My dad was the information officer for the Irgun.
That's amazing. And also you yourself, if not mistaken, volunteered as a civilian in an army base, 1991. It's in your biography.
Yeah.
We
we used to argue with my dad when he would get about politics and stuff like that. I used to say, you know what? You're nothing but a terrorist anyway.
So, yes, very much the right side of the map at the time. We should
also
point
fought
out
in the
for
War
Israel.
of Independence.
Yeah, I mean, and
So,
you have been very vocally supportive of Israel throughout this after October 7th. That those aren't all of the voices in the Democratic Party. Does that bother you at all?
It's not all the voices in America.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I wouldn't limit it to the Democratic Party. It's not all. I mean, there's a great deal of focus on it given the history of the. You know, I grew up in a home. So let me back up. You talk about my father. You know, he born and raised in Israel, et cetera, fought in the War of Independence. But my grandfather on my mother's side is a classic American Jewish. You know, comes in the pogroms of Eastern Europe from Moldova rather, goes as a 13-year-old shipped to Chicago, and he's a truck driver, a meat cutter, a steel worker. He puts the family roots down. My mother's a nurse. My uncle is a truck driver. You know, my aunt is an accountant or assistant to an accountant. Then the next generation, you know, like my brothers and I, do what we do. And one's a doctor, one's works in entertainment.
We heard about them as well.
Yeah. So anyway, so I'm saying it's a classic, you know, and my grandfather was a socialist who, because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the family goes all in on the Democratic Party. And, you know, I jokingly say I grew up in a home where being a Democrat was one of the 10 lost tribes. And so that's, you know, who we are. When you say to me, my support for Israel isn't that's also true in the United. I think that's not more. It's all. Yes, it's a debate in the Democratic Party because of the historical roots of the Jewish community with the Democratic Party. It's also a debate in the United States beyond the Democratic Party.
You're in that neat Irgun Democrat crossover demographic.
It's a very niche group in the Democratic Party.
We're going to have to finish, but just one last thing.
I'm not so sure that I would ever get in the Irgun. So I just want to be right.
Okay.
Some people think I do my politics like that, but I'm not so sure my ideology would be accepted. But keep going.
That's why it's a niche bit of the Venn diagram where the two meet.
Well, I definitely can argue I would never be accepted into the Stern gang. That for sure. Okay.
That was a tough crowd. Before we leave it, it's going to be our last question. But friend of this podcast, David Axelrod, has been saying for a long time that the person who should be heading the DNC, the Democratic National Committee, not now because you didn't do it, but at some point is you. So before we leave you, are you going to come back into frontline Democratic politics, capital D?
No, look, I love public service. So you talk about, I love public service. I grew up and I just gave you my family genealogy. I do believe with John Kennedy, there's nothing more noble than public service. I have a good education, the love of my parents. I pass that on to my kids. I think there's nothing more important than to give something back to this country that has been good to our family. I have 2 kids in the armed forces in the United States. They could do other things in life. They've chosen that as a way. And I've told all the kids, you have to do something to contribute to the wellness of the country, not the wellness of yourself. You owe that to the country. And they have followed that. And I emotionally and psychologically love public service. I'll find a way to continue to serve. Now, in my career, I have been appointed 3 times, Senior Advisor President Clinton, Chief of Staff for Obama, and then Ambassador to Japan by President Biden. I have run for Congress, and I have run for mayor. So I'm not sure which venue it will take. I'm hoping public service is not done with me, because I'm not done with it. I don't know how it will come about, but I find it rewarding. And I think if you're going to live a life, this is my view, you should. I think that's been true in any one of the positions I've had. Your responsibility is to leave the world a better place. I think the United States-Japan relationship is better, stronger than my tenure. I know for a fact the education and graduation and reading scores and math scores of the children in Chicago are better during my tenure than when I found them. And graduation, by way of example, grew by 30 some odd points, as did college attendance. So that's your responsibility, and only in public life can you do that. So I don't know where it will go. I'm only back from Japan less than 3 full weeks. But like my mother, Jonathan, you have demanded me to answer a question I'm not going to answer. And not only are you well read and well written, you're just now like my mother. So now that's really a pain.
No higher praise. No higher praise is possible.
Don't be so assuming that was said with praise.
Well, we are definitely made better by this conversation. So,
Okay.
Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, we really do thank you for coming on Unholy.
Thank you very much, guys. All right, bye-bye.
So, Ambassador Rahm Emanuel, a force of nature. I mean, I haven't spoken to him before, but I was right in the mixer with him straight away. He is, pugilistic and, but such a brilliant strategic brain. You can see, and I mentioned to him how, Axelrod and other big Democrats really want that guy at the helm, making the decisions. You can see why. He thinks very clear. I mean, that point about where he said, diplomacy, it's just politics on a different chessboard. He knew he doesn't scream diplomat. He's a very unlikely ambassador. This is a hardball operative. I think it's a famous story about him sending someone who had crossed him politically a fish in the post, like a dead fish, just to send a message. I mean, this is a hardball operator.
Yeah, I remember when he ran for re-election in Chicago in 2015, and the New York Times then reminded the world that his former boss, President Obama, I'm quoting this from the Times, once joked that the loss of part of a middle finger after a meat slicer accident when Mr. Emanuel was a teenager rendered him practically mute. So that is his style. It always was, this sort of brash and feisty. And I think that making an ambassador put him in a really interesting position. He was a very dominant ambassador, by the way, did a lot of good, I think, for the state of Israel after October 7th and other issues. To me, what I found really interesting, I mean, there were a lot of interesting parts in that interview, but when he said the credit for the deal, for the hostage deal, should not be put either on Biden or on Trump, but of the people of Israel who pushed for this deal, the people of Gaza who said, whoever had the courage to say to Hamas, we got to somehow emerge from this rubble. I thought that was a really poignant point. And what he says about the American left, coming from the American left and analyzing the failure in the election, I thought was also a really interesting point that he made.
Yeah, no, he's a force, as I said, and we are very, very glad to have had him on Unholy. We have some awards to hand out.
We do.
I feel as if he's visited or been discussed by the nominations committee before. I feel as if Tucker Carlson...
Not a newbie in
he's
the
not a newbie.
awards,
I feel as if
commission.
the committee in its deliberations has had the case of Tucker Carlson be presented before. But he is back in business again. The former Fox News host, who now, of course, has his own show. His latest theory, because he has gone quite into the sort of place of conspiracy theory. His latest one, bringing together two favourites for the conspiracy theorists in one, is who killed JFK? You know the answer. It's, of course, the Jews. It's Israel killed John F. Kennedy, says Tucker Carlson. I confess, I have not gone down into the rabbit hole yet with Tucker Carlson to find out why exactly he makes the claim. But it just amuses me a little bit because in a kind of, gallows.
Dark amusement,
because as you know, I said, JFK is the mother of all conspiracy theories. People go into that. And, I think there are definitely some questions to answer, but they go deep into that. But the notion of, the culprit being Israel, that is sort of the mother lode. If you're a conspiracy theorist, that is Christmas and Thanksgiving rolled into one. So for that, Tucker Carlson, you are our nominee and I think winner of this week's Chuzpah Award.
Most definitely. I mean, I can't argue that. I'm going to give the Mensch Award. It's going to be a hesitant Mensch Award, but I'm going to do it anyway. And you're going to have to, chime along. But the point is that This week, actually, you sent me this. I should say, we Buffy the Vampire Slayer fans were notified that there is a reboot to this cult television show. I have talked to you about this often, and Buffy, in my opinion, is a feminist masterpiece that deals with mainly the horrors of adolescence and what it means to grow up as a young teenager and a young woman in this world. It affected me quite deeply when I was in the relevant age, and even to this day, there's lines that echo in my head when I need them. I summon them, but to me, look, I would assume we usually think that the hardest thing in the world is to begin a story. I think the hardest thing in the world is knowing how to end a story. And I think there are very few television projects that know how to do that. Perhaps Mad Men is the best example when you feel like they knew from the beginning where this will end. And Buffy is one of them. That ends in a way that is so sort of empowering and feminist and lovely. And to open that up again is dangerous, but perhaps the feminist aspect of it, when you turned it into a heroine that is not 16 or 17, but rather in her 40s, it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. So the Mensch Award goes to the whole project and to Sarah Michelle Gellar, of course, in the title role. I know there are a lot of Buffy fans for some reason who don't like her. I think it's because she wanted to leave the project at some point. I don't know, but I'm going to give her the Mensch Award anyway. And that was my long-winded way of saying, Mr. Friedland, eventually, if you want to continue this friendship, you will have to see Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the original.
I'm glad you've clarified it, because when you said we Buffy fans, I thought there's going to be some listeners who think you're including me in this sorority. I am an outsider on this subject, I'm afraid. This is not something I have yet seen, but you're right, I did alert you. But this, I think you make a very good point about ending, and I think this is becoming a theme, because the other day we talked about When Harry Met Sally, which I think we both think of as a pretty well perfect work of art. Again, sort of the revisiting, just in the case there of a Super Bowl ad, but sort of when something is great and perfect,
don't touch it.
Temptation. Yeah, exactly. Don't touch it. Leave it where it is. You don't need to go back to it. So I sort of know that this was hard for you to praise this initiative, because you're worried what they're going to do to something that is precious to you. So well done for that degree of courage in applauding them in tampering with something. I know.
Hey, Dolly Parton is going to be the executive producer, so they can't do it all wrong, right?
No,
I mean, come on.
No, we haven't had her in the Mensch category. There's something lacking there.
We're giving her a perennial Mensch for Dolly Parton forever.
And writing two absolute standout classics in the same day. Did you know that? Jolene and I Will Always Love You, she wrote them in the same day.
I did not know that.
Yeah,
that is
your
amazing.
Dolly Parton fact. It's incredible.
That is amazing.
There we are. She wrote them both.
At least we don't share our Buffy love, but we do share Dolly Parton admiration.
We do. We're
so
happy
it's okay.
to do that. It's a problem. If ever you think you haven't had a productive enough day, don't think that with Dolly Parton. I think we will remind you again that we are on patreon.com/unholypod, where you can sign up and join up and be part of the unholy fraternity, friend or family. There is this big thing coming up, our Zoom call, so you'll want to sign up for that. And we have a lot
of other stuff coming up, by the way. That's just part of it. We'll also remind our listeners we're on YouTube. If you want to see Jonathan's library, not only hear about it, we will say our big thank you to Michal Porat, and we shall meet next week.
See you then.